Welcome to the People Leaders Podcast, the audio resource for managers and business leaders creating high-performing teams. Join leadership and team development experts Jan and Michelle Turkelson each week as they explore both subjects from every angle. Through practical tips, valuable insights, and compelling interviews with leadership experts around the world, you'll learn how to bring out the best in your staff and how to give your best as a leader.
So, hello, Michelle.
Hello, Jan. How are you?
Excellent. Yeah.
Great.
Still enjoying a little bit of the COVID transition. You know, we're seeing more and more people coming out and about, but there's a lot of people who are still, flexing their style in front of the Zoom rooms. So this episode of our podcast, we have a special guest, which we're really really looking forward to speaking to, and her name is Zoe Routh, and she's one of Australia's leading experts on people stuff, and we are all things people, hence why we're called people leaders. And you know, she talks about the stuff that gets in the way of producing results and also that light people up, and she believes in developing people skills is the gateway to better decisions and greater results. She's worked with individuals and teams internationally and in Australia since 1987. So there is a wealth of expertise that we are going to tease out in this podcast. Zoe has spent the last 30 years showing teams struggling with office politics and silos how to work better together. And she's also authored 3 books. So the first one was Composure, like how centered leaders make the biggest impact. The second one was Moments, leadership when it matters most, and Loyalty is a third one, stop unwanted staff turnover and boost engagement to build lifelong advocates. And don't we all want that? And not only that, Zoe is the chair of the Outdoor Council of Australia, president of the Chamber of Women in Business, and program manager at the Australian Rural Leadership Foundation. And I think Zoe has finished her 4th book, which we are going to talk about in the podcast as well. So welcome, Zoe.
Thank you, Jan. That's wonderful. I just need to clarify that I'm not currently the chair and manager, etc. Those are past roles. So I'm currently independent of any of those positions, but they were joyful.
Great. And how long were you on the board?
The chair of Outdoor Council of Australia, that was a long time ago now, probably a year or so.
Right.
President of the Chamber of Women in Business, about a year as well. And then I was at Outward Bound for 9 years.
Oh, wonderful.
A very long time. And the Australian Rural Leadership Foundation for 5.
So you are a bit of an adventurist, aren't you? An outdoor enthusiast? Because I've read that you had run 6 marathons.
Marathons, congratulations. That is awesome.
Yeah, that feels like a lifetime ago too now. My last one was in 2006. Yeah.
Right. And what's your favorite marathon, do you think?
My first one.
What was that? Where was that?
That was in Canberra, and it was in 2000. So as a younger person, I always made the commitment to run a marathon by the time I was 30. And then I hit 30 and I hadn't run one yet. I'm like, damn it. I have to do it this year or I miss out on my commitment. And my sister, who I'm living in Australia, but I'm Canadian originally. That's hence the accent. My sister was in Montreal at the time, and she decided she would do the marathon with me. She hadn't done one before either. So she trained all through the winter in Montreal on a treadmill. So she did 3-hour training runs on a treadmill and then flew out the day before the marathon all the way from Montreal to Australia. And we ran it together. And so it was a really big deal for all sorts of different reasons. But that was pretty special. Like, you just don't know that you can do it until you do it. And each marathon is fabulous. And the first one is the biggest one, I reckon.
Yeah, well, yeah. Jan would know. She ran a marathon, and you were 50 plus, Jan, when you ran your first marathon. Your first
New York marathon. If I was going to run one, I thought I'm just going to do the New York marathon. We went over with a group of friends. It was a girlfriend's 50th, so we combined that. Yes, and then we went up north to Canada. It was just brilliant. Okay, so let's talk about you, Zoe, and all your people stuff, because, you know, looking at the plethora of information that you speak about and that you're an expert at, we had to really kind of like narrow some of the focus down. And I'm really interested in the topic around what we can learn from the gig economy and digital nomads in relation to employee engagement, because this is a really important indicator for the health of an organisation, and we're always interested in some strategies that people can learn from. So share.
Okay, love to. It's interesting how the gig economy and digital nomads were well ahead of the curve in terms of being prepared for a pandemic. I think what's interesting when we look at the workers who have found themselves in the gig economy deliberately, and digital nomads in particular, why do they opt for this kind of life? And the reasons are largely what Dan Pink highlights in his book Drive. So you may be familiar with these. So Dan Pink says what motivates us most is not necessarily money, but purpose, mastery, and autonomy. And if we look at the gig economy and the digital nomads, autonomy probably sits as the primary reason why people go into that kind of work conditions, where they're their own boss. They have the freedom to operate where and how they choose, making their own hours. And this makes for very engaged workers because they're doing it on their own terms. Mastery, again, for a gig economy and digital nomads, you pick your profession and you go for it. So there's always an opportunity to hone your skills, because if you suck at what you do, you're not going to get any business. So there's an imperative to do it that way. And then the purpose piece is similar. So if you make choices based on what's most important to you, then you're going to show up fully engaged. I do want to add something to what Dan Pink has laid out in his book, and it's from the research by O.C. Tanner 3 years ago, I believe, and they looked at what makes really good work, and they added a layer to that. So purpose appeared there, absolutely. Training and development appeared, but the number one thing they found that made a difference, a real difference to engagement and making good work, is recognition. And I thought that was incredibly powerful because A, it doesn't cost much, B, it doesn't take much time, and 3, it has such a profound impact on how people feel about their work. So whether you are in an office or working remotely, the same drivers apply. So I think there's less about the format of the work in terms of the working conditions, though there is an attachment to that for the gig economy workers and digital nomads. But it's more about those other pieces that apply across how you work.
Yeah, that's so interesting that you say that, Zoe, because we were just running a workshop on performance management, and looking at how a lot of managers feel as though they have to give corrective feedback all the time. You know, that's my role. I've got to steer people in the right direction, as opposed to maybe flipping that and really focusing on what people are doing well and focusing on their strengths and recognizing them for that, and watching the shift in behavior when you take that sort of focus as opposed to a corrective focus. And so we definitely support those areas, particularly around recognition. That's one of the first lessons I learned as a new manager myself when I worked at Outward Bound. My boss gave me a book called The 1 Minute Manager. And I lapped this up. I'm like, I had no idea how to be a manager. I'm like, how does this work? And one of the key principles in there was catch people doing something right. It's like, okay. And I think there's a couple things in that. Like, it's such a simple statement and such a powerful exercise. One, you have to be paying attention to what people are doing.
That's it.
And then telling them what they're doing right. So you have this positive reinforcing loop that brings out the behaviors that you want, as opposed to people always chasing their tail and feeling like they're being whipped every time the manager shows up. Totally. And you're developing a relationship, like a relationship based on sort of positive engagement, as opposed to, oh, my manager's going to, tell me what I'm doing wrong again. Like, it's just, who wouldn't want that?
But even thinking about the flip side of that, like sometimes we actually have to give constructive feedback. However, I think the first premise is, what am I doing as a leader that was able to contribute to that behavior, or that, was I clear? Did I manage expectations and resources and things like that? So when you're always pointing the finger back at you first from that premise and being curious, then I think normally that relationship can then build.
Yeah. And the other thing that we actually could explore, there's just so much we could explore with you this morning, Zoe, is, we talk about the gig economy and digital nomads. During COVID, for example, we have all become like digital nomads, and under one roof, we are having to, play that role of, mother, father, daughter, provider, dog owner, worker, and do it virtually. What we found, so many of our clients, most of their time is on screen, and they've never had to work like this before. However, what it has done is that it has really amped up their ability to learn the technology. They've had to be more autonomous in terms of, working, how am I going to organise my day and get a routine going? They've had to master the technology and find another sense of purpose, during this very, challenging time. And so it's really brought to the fore some of those qualities, I think, for a lot of people.
It's also a massive cognitive load for people.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And I don't think we can underestimate how taxing having to pick up and deal with all those technical things, as you mentioned, and new structural issues, with the underlying uncertainty and stress of a pandemic. So it's no wonder that leaders and teams are tired. And I hear that a lot with the people I'm working with. It's like people are just fatigued. This is, a lot of people should be gearing up right now at end of financial year. Let's go hard. Yeah. And people are just sort of like, when can I get a break?
Yeah. Same. We've heard that. And that's why, from the very beginning, we, Jan and I were saying health, well-being, like put that at the forefront of everything that you do. Get yourself into a rhythm of looking after your health and well-being, because that is what's going to sustain you through this. And of those people that have done that, you can see them, they're sort of rolling through quite nicely. But yes, we have seen that. A lot of fatigue. Now, I've got a question I want to ask you, and this is really about people, coming out of this period and really questioning whether or not they do want to stay in an organisation. As a leader, what are some of the things that we could do to retain those people that we do value, that are considered talent? What are some tips that you've got for our leaders?
I think, first of all, it comes to the question around loyalty, right? And my third book is all around that concept. And I think it's an interesting struggle for leaders, because leaders always want to hang on to people because it makes their life easier. If they're good workers and they know what they're doing, let's just keep them around. So I don't have to go through recruitment and retraining and go back to square one on a lot of things. So there's this desire for leaders to just have stability around their teams. And yet, given the context, the working context in which we find ourselves, which is mobile, adaptable, flexible, where people don't have to stay in one organization for 25 years for job security, and that for young people in particular, it's not a straight line career, it's a portfolio career that we've got. So there's a lot of macro trends in the work environment that are working counter to this desire for leaders to keep their staff around. And I think you kind of, as a leader, if you just want to hang on to people and you're expecting loyalty to equal longevity in a place, you're going to be sadly disappointed. And I think we need to redefine loyalty, first of all, as advocacy, not longevity. So as a leader, we need to spin our focus a little bit from trying to keep people and focus more on creating such an amazing work-life experience for people, an employee experience for people, that they will be advocates no matter how long they stick around for you. And this avoids some of the traps that leaders often play with or fall prey to when they're trying to keep people, whether they engage in perk wars. So they keep throwing out, like, here's a beer fridge and here's a pool table and here's this gym membership. And that's not what people stay for. They brag about the perks, but they don't stay for them.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really important principle to keep in mind as leaders. Like, what can I do to keep people is the wrong frame. It's more about, what can I do right now to create an amazing work experience with my team? So whether they stay long or not, you want to be the team leader and the team that everybody wants to be part of. That everybody wants to be part of your crew because you treat them people well, that you give them positive feedback as well as constructive feedback when needed, that they feel supported, that they can have a sense of purpose, mastery, and autonomy within their sphere, that they do get recognized for their contribution. So those are the principles around which we can definitely focus and invigorate, and we do our best. So if people can love us and still want to leave us.
Yeah. And they have a great experience, whether it's 12 months, 2 years or 3 years, and be advocates for us. They will always be advocates for us. And then when they go on to another organisation, then word gets out, and you just never know. They may come back one day and, you know, the cycle begins again. I love that. Yeah, we want them to be advocates, and that's a lovely way to reframe that word loyalty.
And isn't it interesting that leaders think that they're doing the right thing by actually offering all these perks, but actually, you know, they're discounting the underlying reason why people would either want to go or stay. And so sometimes we get in our own way. You know, we hold our leadership capability back by not exploring the motivation of other people. So what are some other leadership traps that you see, Zoe?
For the individual leader, that some of the traps that people that interrupt their flow or their capability, and this one is a big one, and we hear it all the time. It's imposter syndrome,
right?
And it's like I'm always floored by how many leaders feel like they're not up to the job, that somebody's going to find them out. And I think there's an aspect of it that's debilitating, and there's an aspect of it that's useful. And I think as leaders, we need to be mindful of picking the useful side of it. So what's debilitating about the imposter syndrome? Here's an example. So I was interviewing a leader for my own podcast, and she's an amazing, experienced leader. Her insights were profound. Her manner was calming, and I thought she was great. So she sends me an email and says, I don't think I wanted that to be published. I wasn't happy with my responses. I don't think I'm up to the caliber of the other guests on your show. And she's not the first leader to say that. I'm like, that is just, it drove me mad, because she was discounting. And so she was not even giving herself permission to shine. She was not even giving herself permission to be seen, let alone shine. And I think this is a debilitating thing. And I've seen that debilitation happen mostly with female leaders, occasionally with male leaders. Yeah. They'll still go ahead and do the podcast, but they'll have the same conversation beneath. So that's the debilitating part. The part that's helpful is the imposter syndrome, if we reframe it a little bit, can spin us to a really important attribute, which is humility. And for us as leaders, we want to cultivate three things. I call this the three aspects of the elder archetype that we want to engage and involve into our leadership approach. First one is humility. And that means knowing that you don't know enough, or knowing that you don't know anything at all, which is a little bit different than people are going to find out. It's like, I really know that there's always more to learn. So humility is the first one. Curiosity, which you mentioned earlier, Jan, is the other next most important piece for us becoming elders in our leadership. And being curious about people, being curious about causes, being curious about troubles, being curious about successes keeps us always seeking what's at the heart of the matter and what we can do better and what we can sustain that's already working well. And the third one is care. When we care deeply about the people around us, the people we serve, our stakeholders, our community, then we pivot away from one of the other traps, which I'll get to in a sec. Actually, I'll tell you right now. The other trap is hubris, which is arrogance. So you have these polarities, or these poles, I guess. One is like deep imposter syndrome. At the end of the spectrum, it's arrogance and hubris. And that trap of arrogance is really difficult. So that's what can turn us from being from the elder archetype to the tyrant archetype. So we can be so wise and so compassionate, but as soon as we start thinking too much about how good and wise and compassionate we are, we build up our arrogance, and we start to be judgmental. We start to deny other people's perspectives, and we start to go on a massive ego trip. If you want a great example of that, Adam Newman, the former CEO of WeWork, is a classic example. So he established WeWork, and to be honest, what an amazing concept. It's about community living and co-working for a altruistic purpose. Wow, sounds amazing. And they did so well. The idea took off, they were successful, and his ego took off also. And he was known for wanting to be president of the world as one of his hubris downfalls. You know, I want to be president of the world. He actually literally said that. He became tyrannical in terms of, and dismissive of his staff. It was very difficult for his staff to have any meetings with him. So they'd jump into a cab with him on the way to the airport to get any time with him. So he just became the emperor in his own little empire. And that's an example of how, if we're not mindful about that switch, the arrogant switch, we can go from being really good to being really terrible.
Yeah, and that's why Jen and I are such big advocates of 360-degree feedback. And what we do find is when people do get feedback, they do fall in one of three buckets. One is they underestimate themselves or they overestimate themselves. And then you have that lovely balance in between of those people have really good self-awareness. But there is something about asking for feedback and getting feedback that can help you, get back into balance if you are on either of those ends, I think.
Absolutely. So feedback is the cut-through piece that helps build self-awareness.
Yeah.
I asked a psychologist, like, how do you build self-awareness? What was her point of view around that? And she said, absolutely, it's feedback. Seek it from a number of different people and from different areas. And I think we also need to qualify feedback, because some people are not qualified to give feedback.
Exactly. That's right. And so, we're big advocates of you choosing who obviously you want to get feedback from, but also, being very clear about what you want feedback on. The more specific you can be about the sort of feedback that you want, then you're more likely to incorporate that and have it as a focused and, targeted way to do something with, with your leadership. Now, I want to ask you a question that's in one of your books on the 4 devils of people stuff. Can we explore that a little bit?
Absolutely. That's coming out in my 4th book. So named People Stuff, Beyond Personalities, an Advanced Handbook for Leadership. And we're just weeks away from that being actually physical object. So that's pretty exciting.
Very exciting.
The 4 devils is a lens on the behavior that we find challenging in the workplace. And I've mapped out some of the core behaviors, and they kind of fall out into these caricatures, I guess, or personas. And the first one is the firebug. And the firebug is the kinds of behaviors when you see someone who's angry and argumentative. And they are always challenging and resisting and always pushing their point. And so they always become, they're abrasive. The next one is the storm driver. Also angry, but more emotional than the firebug. So they can be argumentative, but what you notice about us when we get into a storm driver situation is that we hear the emotion more than the argument. Whereas the firebug, we definitely hear the argument and we hear the ferocity of the argument behind it. The third one is the water bomber. And this is less about argument and more about emotion. And this is when we have trouble managing our emotions. And it can be either 2 ways. We either shut down or we are overwhelmed by our emotions. And so the water bomber leaves a wake around the people around them. You kind of just, you don't want to be around them. They're icky. They're very draining. And the 4th one is the ground splitter. This is where someone does not have the ability to either confront their feelings or the issue, and they do it in back channels. So they have backbiting and undermining and, gossiping and building alliances behind the scenes instead of having open discussions.
Passive aggressive and
that's exactly right.
Wow.
So these behaviors, I think on the outset, what leaders often do, which is a mistake, is blaming it on personalities. And so if you have any of these devils, one or multiple of them in your workplace, we often think they're just a problematic personality. And I contest that. I often think, And you alluded to it earlier, Jan, is that we always need to look in the mirror. What am I doing to contribute to this? It's not just about the relationship between the boss and their team. It's what are the systems, what are the patterns that are driving that behavior? What are the fundamental issues? And all of those behaviors are really triggered from a survival mechanism. So they're all amygdala hijacked responses. So there's a particular set of drivers that are creating that behavior. And if you look at the patterns, the firebug, often they are triggered by a loss of power, loss of autonomy. That's why they get argumentative, because that is a threat. For the storm driver, they can get triggered by a loss of or threat to their position, loss of position relative to others. And that's a status threat. So some of the work of David Rock is all kind of informed into this.
Yeah, love it.
For the water bomber, what's often threatens us if we're experiencing water bomber behaviors is a loss of place within a group. So that sense of belonging is somehow, and connection is often uprooted. And for the ground splitter, can be a complex one. It can be actually any of those triggers, but sometimes it's also it's a difficult one because it can be triggered by any of those ones. Also, loss of productivity or loss of performance can drive us into ground splitter. But the key ingredient missing for the ground splitter is the ability to articulate their feelings. Similar to the water bombers, to be able to identify and articulate. So the solution out of all these is twofold. One is to identify what are the systems that are creating those triggers in people and work on that. So what's your remuneration strategy? What is your promotion strategy? What's your recognition strategy? Are they working against you and creating these behaviors? Are they working for you? So that's one place to look at it. And the second place to look at in terms of curing these four devils is to building the emotional resilience and capacity and intelligence of you and your team. And I say you and your team because it's very easy to say, oh, they're a firebug and we all get triggered the same way. We might have one particular one that we gravitate to, that we show up. Like for me, I'm a water bomber. If I get triggered by something, I have struggled with my emotion, and I don't usually shut down. It's more overflowing and find it difficult to articulate an argument at that point or a perspective. So those are the four devils.
Oh, fantastic. And they, and as you were going through them, I thought, oh yeah, I can see that, and I can see managers, how they deal with that. And like you said, the managers, we do as managers create the culture that either allows the firebug to take off or allows the ground splitter to do what they're doing. We play such a pivotal role, don't we, as managers?
But also your point about the systems and structures, like what is this system or process? What is this what behavior is this encouraging me to do? Is this system or process encouraging me to hold on to information because then I am going to be more recognized? And so therefore I'm going to be remunerated? Or does this system or structure encourage me to share information and to build the capacity of my team? And I think as leaders, that's a real, because it's not a quick fix. You actually have to chip away at some of those systems and structure, but just start with the one closest to you, that you've got control. Yeah.
So I've got a CEO that I'm working with who's got a challenge. And he said, my entire team, one after the other, one at a time, have been in my office complaining about the others. He goes, what's wrong with them? I'm like, mirror, put it up. What are you doing what are you not doing to facilitate open conversation with the group? That's the first question. And then the second part is, right. So what is the process that you have documented that allows people to raise issues? And what is the history in terms of raising issues? So once bitten, what's that expression? Once bitten,
twice shy.
Thank you. So maybe they've bitten more than once, and they're shy about raising issues as a team because of the way it was handled previously, even when he was not around. So it's a convoluted thing, but I think as leaders, we need to think, first of all, it's like, if I've got a struggling team, there's possibly something I'm contributing to it, but then I have to unpick and establish new norms, new practices. So this whole push about let's have vulnerable, open-hearted teams, that doesn't happen overnight.
No.
and it takes several repeated positive experiences for people to feel like they're safe in that environment, and they can actually do that themselves. So a lot of work.
Oh, totally.
But you gave people a strategy or a process to actually start that. By agreeing, how are we going to set up a way that we can have those robust conversations? Because that's part of the behaviour of a high-performing team, is that they can have those robust behaviours in the moment, as opposed to the corridor conversations that the ground splitter would be using, like in the background. Yeah. So tell us, what are you working on at the moment, Zoe?
Just about to launch the People Stuff book. So that's been all-consuming, absolutely. We're rolling out different workshops and masterclasses and programs based on the content of that book. And the book is really about perspective, how we see ourselves, how we see others, how we see the bigger picture. And as leaders, if we're to be wise and compassionate leaders, we need to work on our practice of perspective. So we need to expand how we look at things from a time point of view, the horizon point of view, complexity point of view. And then we need to also hone our skills to discern and make quality decisions. So expand and contract, or expand and discern, are two of the qualities of perspective, as well as the wisdom and compassion piece, which is best of the heart, best of the mind, and how you work with each of those. So that's the lens through which we look at the whole book. And then we look at how we see ourselves. What are the archetypes that we can lean on, depending on our particular business circumstance and purpose, that will help bring our leadership strategy, our leadership beingness, our leadership presence to a different level that helps others move in the direction that we want to go in together. And then we talked about the four devils, which is about the perspective on others. And the last chapter is really about how we see the bigger picture. What's our circle of concern, and how big can we make it? How inclusive and expansive can we hold a space so that we can be influential leaders that have a global impact as ripples in a pond?
I know there is the balance between the art and the science of leadership, isn't it? Like there are some principles and rules, but there's also, that capacity for the human being to actually expand their repertoire of behaviour, which is kind of perspective. So I'm just interested in your perspective on this, Zoe, is that we have a lot of clients that we coach who are very good at the attention to detail, as opposed to looking at the 30,000 foot view. What piece of advice would you give these people that I know that's what I need to do? I need to actually broaden my perspective. But what is a strategy, like something practical that they could start to employ or embody?
There's a couple. So a couple from the futurists. So the practice of futurism, which sounds really like crystal balling, but it's not that at all. One is environmental scanning. And it's a really nice practice. Like, what are the mega trends out there in the world? And so they can apply their attention to detail skill and ability to research and having a look at what are the big picture trends that are affecting the world. Then you can build scenario plans after that. So that's a practical technique that you can do. One of the ones I also like to encourage people to develop this ability to look at the bigger picture is to practice systems thinking. And the easiest way to get a handle on that is to mind map. So you can mind map the dynamics of a team. You can mind map the interactions of different parts of the organization and look at the cause, consequence, and correlations and relationships between the different business units and the different peoples. That's a really powerful exercise for someone who's caught in the detail to look at the bigger picture. It's like, what are the interconnected moving parts? And one of my favorite techniques is called the problem tree, which is where you start with a surface problem. And then from that, you draw down two bubbles and go, what are the two things that are contributing to that? And then from each of those second bubble layers, you drill down again and give each of them two causal reasons. Like, what are the two factors that are contributing to that second level tier? And you keep going. And what happens is it gets you to think more deeply. This is the zooming in part into the causes of a surface issue. So those are a couple of ways that people can practically do to start looking at the bigger picture. But the complexity piece is a really core leadership skill that leaders need to accelerate into quickly. because our contexts are no longer linear and contained. They are dynamic, global, and interactive.
Yeah, and we need to actually practice to see the patterns and then preempt what those patterns could possibly be. So that was some really good,
very practical
techniques. I love the problem tree, so I'm going to put that in my back pocket. Thank you, Zoe.
So thank you, Zoe. That was fantastic. Jan, do you have any more questions for Zoe? I mean, we could have another podcast, but we've run out of time.
Biggest takeaway, Michelle, what did you get?
Oh, you know what? I love the elder archetype.
Me too. They're the notes I had. Yes.
Yeah. This is why we're twins, or why we're twins and we're so simpatico. But we often talk about, curiosity and care, and I love the, incorporating humility into that. And what a wonderful thing to aspire to be, that elder archetype. Love it. And look, just taken so much away. You are just you are full of so much information, Zoe.
So Zoe, how can people find you? Like, we'll have links in your bio and in our show notes, but if people wanted to research, where's the best place?
2 places. My website, zoerouth.com. So that's ZoeRouth. It's like mouth with an R, .com. And then on LinkedIn, I'm fairly active on LinkedIn. So if people want conversations, they can jump on there and see what I've been writing and sharing.
Yes, wonderful. And good luck with your book launch. I'm definitely going to go out and buy it and have a look. I think you've got some wonderful strategies, and we're all about practical strategies, and you've got them. So that's wonderful.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Thanks, Zoe.
Thanks, guys.
Zoe.
It's been a
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the People Leaders Podcast. For show notes and other resources, please visit us at peopleleaderspodcast.com. While you're there, you can subscribe for future episodes so you can continue your own leadership journey. And please be sure to share this and other episodes with your friends and colleagues. The People Leaders Podcast is brought to you by the Experts on Air Podcast Network.